The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Lasting from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War wasn't a direct military conflict. Instead, it was a war of ideologies. Capitalism versus communism. It played out in proxy wars, espionage, arms races, and diplomatic confrontations across the globe. At its core, the Cold War was about influence and control. The United States sought to promote democracy and free markets, while the Soviet Union aimed to spread communism and establish a global socialist order. The roots of the Cold War lay in the stark differences between the United States and Soviet ideologies. The United States championed capitalism, where private enterprise and individual freedoms were the foundation of society. The Soviet Union, led by the Communist Party, advocated for state-controlled economies and collective ownership, aiming to build a classless society. These differences were more than just political, they shaped global alliances. In 1949, the United States and its Western allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to counter Soviet influence in Europe. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, binding Eastern European countries to its sphere of influence. Europe was divided by what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain, a symbolic and physical boundary that separated the democratic West from the communist East. As the Cold War unfolded in the late 1940s, Europe became the primary battleground for influence. Germany, defeated in World War II, was divided into two: West Germany, supported by the United States and its allies, and East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. In 1948, the first major Cold War confrontation occurred during the Berlin Blockade. The Soviets blocked all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out of the city. Instead of giving in, the United States launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in food and supplies to sustain West Berliners for nearly a year, demonstrating its commitment to countering Soviet aggression. Meanwhile, both superpowers were developing nuclear weapons at a rapid pace. The United States had used atomic bombs to end World War II, and by 1949 the Soviet Union had successfully tested its own atomic bomb. This began the dangerous nuclear arms race, with both nations stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, creating the ever-present fear of global annihilation. Although the Cold War never erupted into direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it fueled proxy wars, conflicts where the superpowers supported opposing sides to gain influence. These wars allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to expand their ideologies without risking all-out nuclear war. One of the first major proxy wars was the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the United States and a coalition of United Nations forces. After 3 years of brutal fighting, the war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel. Another pivotal moment came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States coast, brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in intense negotiations, which eventually led to the removal of the missiles, but the crisis underscored how fragile the peace between the superpowers was. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War became a major flashpoint in the Cold War. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, intervened in Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The war dragged on for years, costing millions of lives and ending in a humiliating defeat for the United States when Saigon fell in 1975. In the late 1960s and 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to ease Cold War tensions through a period known as Détente. This era was marked by a series of arms control agreements aimed at reducing the threat of nuclear war. The SALT I Treaty, or Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in 1972, limited the number of ballistic missile launchers both sides could possess. Additionally, symbolic moments like President Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972 signaled a thaw in Cold War hostilities. However, détente was short-lived. The Soviet Union's 1979 invasion of Afghanistan renewed Cold War tensions. The United States saw this as an expansion of Soviet influence into the Middle East and responded by arming Afghan rebels, or mujahideen, in a brutal decade-long conflict that drained Soviet resources and morale. The early 1980s saw a renewed arms race under U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who ramped up defense spending and introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative nicknamed Star Wars, a plan to develop a missile defense system to protect against Soviet nuclear attacks. Reagan famously called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and the tension between the superpowers reached new heights. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War was entering its final chapter. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and introduced reforms like glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet economy and making the government more transparent. However, these reforms inadvertently weakened the Soviet grip on its satellite states. In 1989, the world watched as the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain, was torn down by jubilant crowds in East and West Berlin. This event marked the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe, signaling the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved, following failed reforms, internal dissent, and the independence movements of its republics. The once mighty superpower was no more, and with it, the Cold War came to an end. The Cold War defined much of the 20th century, shaping global politics, alliances, and conflicts for nearly 5 decades. Although it never led to direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, it caused immense suffering through proxy wars, fostered the development of dangerous nuclear arsenals, and left a lasting impact on international relations. Today, the legacy of the Cold War continues to influence geopolitics, as former Cold War adversaries remain major players on the world stage. The world may have avoided nuclear catastrophe, but the lessons of the Cold War about diplomacy, power, and ideology still resonate.